Who could have imagined that one of the most grandiose private palaces in the United States of America would be born not from ancient family grandeur, but from the ambitions of a man who came into the world not in a castle at all, but in an ordinary house in German Mannheim, far from the glamour of New York salons. No one knew then that this boy, Otto Hermann Kahn, son of an undistinguished though respected banking clerk, would one day build a place that would become a symbol of the era, inspiration for literary immortality, and at the same time, a mystery hidden in the hills of Long Island. It seemed impossible that a man who had to fight for his own place in society in his youth would erect a house capable of competing with European palaces. But the question we are posing right now, why did Kahn need to create not just a residence, but a fortress of grandeur on an artificial hill? What was he trying to prove to the world, or perhaps to himself? At the beginning of the 20th century, Long Island was flourishing as a haven for new millionaires, people who sought to rewrite their own destinies by erecting palaces where their names could sound just as confidently as the surnames of ancient aristocracy. However, Otto Kahn's story does not fit into the usual image of new money that appears suddenly and strives only for external glamour. In Kahn, there was something else, a combination of refinement, almost European meticulousness to details, and the iron will of a man who saw the world in numbers, schemes, and strategies. When in 1914 the first workers began to raise the huge man-made hill that would become the foundation of the future Oheka castle, few understood the scale of the plan. Before them lay only earth that needed to be raised higher than nature itself. But for Kahn, this was only the beginning. He wanted his house to rise not just physically, but symbolically, so that no gaze turned from the surrounding valleys could pass by what he was creating. And yet, even at the moment of the birth of this colossus, a faint shade of tragedy was already felt. The house, destined to outlive both its first owners and the era and the very idea of private luxury, was already then something more than just a residence. The initial contrast here is striking. A man who once started as a modest banking clerk now intended to build the second largest private home in the entire country. And although the walls were still only rising, the viewer of today can feel how something predestined is woven into this story. Kahn's rise, his influence, his dream of beauty and power, all this leads us to a question that still remains open. What hides behind the facade of Long Island's most ambitious private estate? The path into this mystery is only just beginning. To understand why Otto Hermann Kahn even saw the possibility of building not a house, but an entire world, we need to return to his origins, to those roots that both limited him and shaped his unique worldview. He was born in 1867 in Mannheim, in a Jewish family that valued education, work, and discipline. His father, a banker by profession, did not possess titles or land holdings, but possessed what was valued no less in Germany at that time, the reputation of an honest man with a precise mind. In childhood, the future creator of Oheka Castle studied at a Realschule, then served his mandatory military service, and afterward entered the banking sector, where he quickly began to notice what others did not see: hidden structures, flows of capital, weak points, and opportunities. Each of his advancements was not a matter of luck, but a matter of calculation. At the end of the 19th century, he moved to London, where he worked at the Spire & Co. banking house, and later, in the early 90s, relocated to the United States of America, joining the influential Kuhn, Loeb, and Coors here in New York. He encountered a world where old money, families like the Vanderbilts, controlled social structures. Kahn, despite his wealth and brilliant mind, remained an outsider. And here emerges the first significant hook. His worldview was formed not only from the pursuit of success, but also from quiet resistance to the barriers that did not accept him. This internal conflict, a man of enormous abilities but with limited social access, became the foundation of his strategy. He did not try to break into places where he was not expected. He created his own spaces, his own stages, where he himself set the rules. It is no wonder that contemporaries noted, Khan always acted through the creation of systems, rather than trying to fit into others. This was evident in his patronage activities and in his interest in music, art, architecture. He was not just a financier, but a man of deep aesthetic taste, although this does not make him an ideal hero. In him coexisted both the desire for beauty and the desire for control. Khan worked in an era of rapid changes. World War I, the rapid growth of American cities, the rise of young magnates, all this made the social arena especially tense. He saw this world as a chessboard, where some players cling to the past while others rise swiftly and crudely. And amid these forces, he created his own response. Not to build a factory or a chain of bank offices, but to create something as material as it was symbolic, a house that would serve as a tangible form of his convictions. By this time in his life, the first fundamental strategy had already formed. When the system closes doors, he builds his own house with its own entrance. And this entrance, as the further story will show, would become one of the most discussed architectural symbols of the 20th century. In this lies an unexpected turn that will determine the further course of events. The construction of Oheka Castle was not just ambition, but a philosophical gesture, an expression of a worldview formed from struggle, calculation, and the pursuit of beauty. By the time Otto Kahn firmly decided to build his own residence on Long Island, he already knew it would not be just a house. It would be a space where architecture becomes a language, and every line an expression of position. By the beginning of the 20th century, he had become a figure so influential that his name was spoken in the same breath with the country's largest financiers. But influence is one side of the coin. The other, the feeling that he remains different, even among those who envied him. It was precisely this duality that pushed him toward the idea of creating something so perfect that it would become an argument in itself. The choice of location was strategic. Long Island was experiencing its golden age, becoming a place where new American elites built mansions on the scale of European palaces. But Khan did not want to be just another rich man copying the old world. He aspired to architecture that both appeals to history and transcends it. His taste leaned toward the Italian Renaissance, toward pure forms, symmetry, structures where every detail is subordinate to the overall geometry of power. And yet even this style in his hands ceased to be merely a tribute to aesthetics. It transformed into an idea of order. As soon as he acquired the vast plot in Cold Spring Harbor, work began that would astonish any engineer. The hill on which Oheka Castle stands today is not a gift of nature. It is a gigantic man-made mound created by the hands of thousands of workers who, for weeks and months, moved earth to elevate the future house above everything surrounding it. Khan did not just build a house on top, he was building a foundation for fundamentality. He literally lifted the earth to create a point from which the house would look down on the valley from above. Engineers recalled that there was no end in sight to the work. Lifting machines, dump carts, people who step by step turned the flat surface into a monumental platform. And here it is important to feel the hidden dramaturgy. A man who started from zero now raises the earth for his residence as if rewriting geography. This is not a gesture of wealth. This is a gesture of self-declaration. Khan was a meticulous client. He monitored the blueprints, discussed materials, demanded harmony of proportions. His partner became the architect Delano, a man who seemed to understand Khan's language without words. Together they created a project that was not just big, it was designed to inspire respect. The house was to be beautiful, but not soft, majestic, but not theatrical. This was architecture of power, hidden under the guise of refinement. However, already at the moment when the project was only taking shape, a question arose that today seems inevitable. Was Khan not trying to compensate with the scale of the building for what seemed unattainable in society? Was not this hill, literally and metaphorically, a way to rise above those who did not accept him into their closed circles? Or on the contrary, was he building a space where beauty and order, his personal values, could finally manifest fully? The answer is still hidden. But one thing is already clear. The construction of Oheka Castle became the beginning of an architectural odyssey in which every column, every balcony, every meter of man-made earth, part of the biography of a man who wanted to prove to the world that power can be expressed through symmetry and authority through proportion. And all this makes the next chapter even more intriguing. For the house that began as an ideal later became a legend, a myth. When the foundation finally stood in place and the man-made hill acquired its final outlines, before the eyes of the workers and architects for the first time emerged the true scale of the plan. Now it became obvious. Oheka Castle would not be just a house for the family. It would be something like a modern citadel, a fortress of culture, intellect, and symbolic power. It was then, in the silence of the construction site, where the smell of fresh earth and lime hung in the air, that the legend began to form, which would later be called the American Renaissance. The work progressed rapidly, but every detail required attention. Khan tolerated no compromises. He wanted everything, from the stone tracery to the angle of the staircases, to correspond to strict aesthetic principles that he considered almost mathematical. The project resembled not the construction of a private residence, but the unfolding of a gigantic chess combination, where every move was planned in advance. This revealed Khan's character. He was not a man of impulses, he was a man of structure. At that time, many of his acquaintances, banking house colleagues, and even members of the New York establishment wondered, why does a man who spends most of his life in business trips and negotiations need a house comparable in size to European palaces? The answer lies deeper than the desire to display wealth. Khan was not building for the external public. He was building for his own internal world order. His patronage activities, support for musicians, artists, theaters, had long distinguished him from other financiers of that time. But art itself was for him only part of a broader design. He saw in art and architecture ways to build a world where beauty shapes consciousness. The house for him was a kind of laboratory of ideals, a place where aesthetics and reason meet and begin to dictate their rules to the surrounding life. It was precisely for this reason that the central core of the future residence became not the living room, not the banquet hall, but the inner courtyard, the cloister, inspired by monastic silence and the strict symmetry of Italian palazzos. For some, this would seem a strange choice. Why in a billionaire's house a space reminiscent of a monastic gallery? But for Khan it was fundamental. He sought to create a place where order and peace would exist independently of the external world, a world noisy, chaotic, irregular. The cloister became the heart of the house, like an inner metronome setting the rhythm for the entire residence. The paradox is that the larger Oheka Castle grew, the more intense the conversations around it became. Newspapers mentioned it as the boldest private construction on the East Coast. Architectural critics speculated whether Khan was trying to revive Italian principles of the castle state on an American scale. Envious people grumbled as if he was trying to buy himself status. Friends, on the contrary, said that he was building for the first time a house that matches his inner world, strict, harmonious, and incredibly demanding. Interestingly, Khan himself did not comment on these rumors. He did not like to explain his decisions. He preferred the language of action. And so the house continued to grow, as if materializing the silent idea that he once formulated to his close ones. If beauty and order can exist somewhere, they must begin with the house where you live. But already then, even before the last tile would be laid, a new intrigue arose that no one voiced aloud. Could this house, so conceptual, so perfectly built, become a real home filled with human life and not a museum of thought? Or was it created from the very beginning as a monument and not as a dwelling? There is no answer yet. But the shadow of this question already falls on the scaffolding and the first gleam of marble, foreshadowing a story in which beauty and humanity do not always go hand in hand. When the outer walls of Oheka Castle began to rise above the horizon of Long Island, it became clear that the project had outgrown the framework of a private residence. The house was not yet completed, but it already lived its own life, changing the attitude of those around toward the very concept of wealth. Workers, architects, engineers, everyone who came to the construction site felt a strange combination of discipline and grandeur, as if they were participating not in construction, but in the creation of a new era. Khan appeared on the site almost daily. He could stand in silence for several minutes, studying the next fragment of the facade, and then unexpectedly point out a detail that no one else noticed. "This line disrupts the breathing of the space," he would say, and demand to redo the element that seemed ideal to most. His perfectionism was so uncompromising that at times it seemed like eccentricity. But later, many admitted, it was precisely this rigidity that turned Oheka Castle into a masterpiece. The house grew horizontally and vertically at the same time. Staircases intertwined, the building's wings spread out to the sides like the branches of a giant tree, and the inner corridors began to form a complex system in which even experienced builders could get lost. And yet in this branching, logic was felt. Khan demanded that the space be subordinate to man and not man to space. No random rooms, no compromise solutions. Every zone had to have a function and meaning. A special place was occupied by the rooms dedicated to art. The future music salon was designed as a sanctuary of sound, with high ceilings, perfect acoustic geometry, and windows that let in light as if it too were participating in the composition. Guests to whom Khan showed early blueprints recalled his phrase, "Music is the order of emotions, architecture the order of space. They must sound together." Meanwhile, the house was becoming a center of attraction not only for specialists, but also for the general public. People from nearby towns came to the fence to at least catch a glimpse from afar of the banker's castle. Newspapers published articles with hints of megalomania. Some claimed that Khan was building an American counterpart to the Medici palaces. Others, that he was trying to cement his name in history through architecture, not finance. And although most of these interpretations were superficial, they contained an important note. People felt that this house was meant to outlive its creator. At the heart of this entire story lay a psychological knot. Khan still remained a man whose youth was marked by constant struggle for recognition. He knew that in some circles he would never be truly accepted. Neither wealth nor influence erased his foreignness and Jewish origin. But instead of trying to change people, he created a space where the rules belonged only to him. And here arises a new turn. The more the house acquired completion, the less it resembled a typical family residence. It developed a tonal strictness, almost imperial distance, which suited a museum or institute more than a home hearth. It seemed that Oheka Castle was intended not for living, but for demonstration, intellectual, symbolic, aesthetic. But was this a conscious choice of Khan, or an unintended result of his character? He strove for beauty and order, but order too absolute inevitably suppresses life. And at the moment when the roof was almost laid, when the facades finally gleamed in the sunlight, the first shadow of a future paradox began to be felt in the air. Can a person live inside the ideal that he himself built? Or does the ideal, like any perfect form, inevitably repel everything living? The answer is still ahead, but it is too late to retreat. Oheka Castle is becoming a reality, majestic, precise, and dangerously flawless. The crisis entered the life of Oheka Castle not through a dramatic twist of fate, but through the economic tremor that gripped the country in the late 20s. When in October 1929 the stock market crashed, the world of Otto Hermann Kahn began to shift. His banking experience allowed him to understand the scale of what was happening, but even he could not stop the chain reaction. The external splendor of Oheka Castle, this grandiose fortress of his will, suddenly found itself surrounded by fragile financial reality. In these months, the house ceased to be a project of power and became a reminder of the price of ambition. Maintaining the huge estate required a staff of employees, daily expenses, and the constant presence of the owner. But Kahn was increasingly in New York, where he was engaged in saving projects, supporting public initiatives, advocating for cultural programs, trying to hold on to what seemed to be slipping away rapidly. The crisis became that very hook pivot which forced a change in goal. If previously Kahn strove to create a space capable of expressing beauty and order, now the theme of meaning arose before him. He participated more and more often in charitable meetings, supported artists, funded public projects. His public speeches shifted, less about business, more about values and cultural responsibility. However, physically he returned to Oheka Castle less and less. Here, in this house, there was no longer a sense of triumph, but a strange emptiness. The spacious halls, created for music and social evenings, stood silent. The honed geometry of the rooms, which once evoked admiration, now seemed superfluous, almost heavy. It seemed that the house, built as a symbol of overcoming, became a reminder that a person cannot control everything. After Kahn's death in March 1934, it was precisely this feeling that determined the further fate of the estate. His family could no longer maintain a residence of such scale. The house passed from hand to hand, turning now into a temporary school, now into a military facility, now into a nearly abandoned space. In each of these periods, what later historians would call the rebirth of legacy manifested itself. The house ceased to be a personal fortress and became a public burden, and then public potential. And in this transformation, a new perspective emerged on the second character of the entire story, on the house itself, Oheka Castle. Now it became an active player, reflecting the changes of the era. From a private dream, it transitioned to the search for a form of existence that would allow it to regain meaning. This crisis did not break the story. It made its continuation possible, but on different grounds. When at the end of the 20th century Oheka Castle found itself on the brink of disappearance, it became clear the house outlived its creator, but did not outlive its own idea. The scale conceived by Kahn as an affirmation of order and beauty became too heavy for a time when private palaces could no longer be sustained by a single name. And here a new character emerged, not individual, but public. A group of historians, architects, and entrepreneurs saw in the ruins not a burden, but a chance to return to America a lost piece of cultural memory. The revival of the estate began modestly, studying the archives, restoring original plans, returning authentic details. Not for luxury, but for meaning. Thus, the house built as a personal manifesto transformed into an object of heritage, a space where history became more important than ambitions. Today, Oheka Castle lives differently. Concerts, film shoots, and public events take place here. The house no longer hides itself from society. On the contrary, it serves it. And in this lies the final turn. What was once a barrier between Kahn and the world became a bridge between the past and the present. This story resembles the plot of The Great Gatsby, but with a different resolution. Gatsby sought to be seen. Kahn sought to build an ideal. and both confronted the fact that a person cannot eternally hold on to the space he created. But unlike the fictional hero, Oheka Castle received a second life because it found a new purpose. The lesson here is simple and paradoxical. Greatness is not in building something larger than yourself, but in allowing that something to live after you.